Night, 1944. The ground is cold and uneven. Earthworks cut the darkness into shallow angles. For the infantry holding the line, the night is supposed to be protection. It hides movement. It softens fear. It limits what an attacker can see. Then the darkness breaks. A hard white beam snaps on without warning. Narrow, controlled, impossibly bright. It sweeps across the field, flattening shadows, turning men into sharp silhouettes against their own defenses. Eyes that had adjusted to the dark are suddenly useless. Depth collapses. Distance becomes a guess. Every movement feels exposed. The light does not flicker like a flare. It does not drift or fade. It moves, steady and deliberate, as if the night itself is being pushed aside. Somewhere behind the beam, engines idle low. Steel tracks grind forward with measured confidence. The light advances with them, cutting lanes through trenches, wire, and fear. This is not illumination for comfort. It is illumination as a weapon. And as the glare holds the ground in place, the men beneath it begin to understand something unsettling. This night was planned, engineered, and rehearsed long before the beam ever turned on. To understand how such a weapon came to exist, we must step back into a war struggling to master the darkness itself. By the late 1930s, every major army understood the same uncomfortable truth. Night fighting was unavoidable, but deeply unreliable. Darkness protected movement, but it also erased coordination. Units lost direction. Timetables slipped. Attacks dissolved into confusion before reaching enemy lines. Commanders knew that if they could somehow control the night, they could control the battlefield. During the First World War, armies had tried to solve this problem crudely. Fixed searchlights illuminated no man's land, but they did more harm than good. Once switched on, they became immediate targets. Flares helped briefly, but they drifted, burned out, and revealed attackers as often as defenders. By 1918, illumination was still a blunt tool, useful but dangerous. Between the wars, militaries revisited the problem with new urgency. Mechanization had changed everything. Tanks could move in darkness. Infantry could advance faster. Engineers could breach obstacles under cover of night. But the problem remained the same. Without light, coordination failed. With light, exposure followed. In Britain, this dilemma became acute after 1939. The British Army, expecting to fight a defensive war in Europe, began studying how to attack fortified positions after dark. River lines, trench systems, minefields, without surrendering surprise. The question was no longer whether to illuminate, but how to do it without revealing the source. The answer emerged from an unlikely place. In 1937, British officers observing civilian industrial demonstrations saw high-intensity carbon arc searchlights capable of producing extraordinary brightness. Unlike conventional lamps, these lights could be tightly focused, filtered, and mechanically controlled. Engineers began to ask whether such light could be weaponized, not by lighting everything, but by selectively lighting what mattered. By 1940, with Britain fighting for survival, the idea had matured. Instead of placing searchlights in static positions, vulnerable to artillery and direct fire, planners proposed mounting them inside armored vehicles. Tanks could move with advancing troops. Armor could protect the light source. Mobility could allow illumination to appear, disappear, and shift direction without warning. This concept became the foundation of what was soon called the Canal Defense Light, or CDL. The name itself was a deception. Even many British officers believed it referred to defensive equipment meant to protect waterways in England. In reality, the program was something far more ambitious. A tank designed not to fire shells, but to reshape the battlefield's visibility. Secrecy was absolute. CDL units trained in isolated areas. Vehicles were disguised as standard tanks. Crews were told little about where or when they might be used. Even Allied commanders often had no idea what the machines were for. The reasoning was simple. Once the enemy understood the system, countermeasures would follow. By 1941, prototypes were being tested on Matilda II tank chassis, later on Grant and Sherman tanks. The turret was replaced with a sealed, armored housing containing the light. Instead of an open beam, the illumination exited through a narrow vertical slit, just inches wide, reducing exposure while preserving intensity. Inside, operators could manipulate shutters, filters, and angles, turning the beam into a controlled instrument rather than a flood of light. The goal was not to light the battlefield evenly. It was to blind defenders, flatten their night vision, and create sharp contrast, illuminated ground ahead, darkness behind, forcing enemy infantry to fight inside a visual tunnel they did not control. British planners believed this could be decisive during night river crossings, amphibious landings, and assaults on prepared positions. Engineers could work under light. Infantry could see obstacles. Tanks could advance without losing formation. In 1942, the United States took notice. American officers, preparing for large-scale amphibious warfare, recognized the potential value of armored illumination. The U.S. Army adopted the CDL concept, trained units in secrecy, and integrated the system into broader assault planning. Like the British, they guarded the program closely, so closely that entire CDL battalions crossed into Europe without clear instructions on when they would be used. By the time Allied forces prepared for major offensives in 1944, the technology existed, the crews were trained, and the doctrine was written. What remained uncertain was not whether the light worked, but whether war would allow it to be used as intended. Because while planners saw a tool for order and control, the battlefield had a way of reshaping even the most carefully engineered ideas. And it was in that tension between theory and combat that the true meaning of armored searchlights would finally be tested. By 1943, the Canal Defense Light program existed in a strange state, fully developed, fully trained, and largely unused. Hundreds of crews had spent months learning a role unlike any other in armored warfare. They were not gunners in the traditional sense. They did not practice target engagement. Instead, they trained in timing, coordination, and restraint. When to switch on, when to cut the beam, how to sweep ground without lingering long enough to invite fire. Inside a CDL tank, the atmosphere was cramped and technical. The carbon arc lamp required constant adjustment. Electrodes burned down and had to be repositioned during operation. Cooling systems labored to manage heat. The operator worked shutters that could blink the beam, brief pulses designed to disorient rather than illuminate continuously. This was illumination as a precision task, not a spectacle. The beam itself was engineered to be deceptive. Filters could alter color slightly. The narrow slit reduced the visible source to a thin vertical line, making it harder for defenders to judge the tank's exact position. To an infantryman on the ground, the light did not feel like a lamp. It felt like an opening in the darkness, advancing steadily toward them. Doctrinal manuals envisioned specific uses. CDL tanks would move behind the first wave of assault troops, lighting minefields and wire for engineers. They would illuminate riverbanks during crossings, allowing boats and bridging units to operate at night. They would sweep enemy trench lines just long enough for infantry to close the distance, then cut the beam before defenders could adjust. In theory, the system was elegant. In practice, war imposed limits. By the time Allied forces landed in North Africa and later in Italy, commanders were cautious. The Mediterranean theater offered fewer ideal conditions for CDL use. Terrain was broken. Enemy positions were often elevated. Artillery observation was effective, and commanders worried that any visible light, no matter how controlled, would become a magnet for fire. As a result, many CDL units waited. They trained. They rehearsed. They moved forward and back across theaters with their purpose still classified. Crews knew they possessed something unusual, but many went months without seeing it used operationally. In Northwest Europe, the situation was similar. During preparations for the Normandy invasion, Allied planners considered the use of armored illumination for night assaults following the landings. But the complexity of the operation and the sheer density of artillery, aircraft, and naval gunfire made commanders reluctant to introduce another variable. Instead, CDLs were assigned cautiously, held in reserve, or repurposed. Some were used not as blinding weapons, but as battlefield lighting tools, illuminating river crossings such as the Rhine in March 1945, where Allied forces needed sustained light to move men, vehicles, and supplies across water under pressure. In these cases, the searchlights were sometimes angled upward, reflecting light off cloud cover to create a broad, indirect glow rather than a direct beam. It was effective, but different from the original vision. Meanwhile, across the world in the Pacific, U.S. forces faced a very different enemy. Japanese infantry doctrine emphasized night infiltration, concealment, and endurance. Darkness was not just cover, it was an extension of the defensive system. Cave networks, jungle terrain, and dispersed positions relied heavily on limiting the attacker's visibility. American planners recognized that armored illumination could, in theory, be devastating against such defenses. Requests were made. CDL units were earmarked, but distance, shipping priorities, and the pace of operations meant that by the time equipment and trained crews were available, major Pacific campaigns were already reaching their final phases. The weapon arrived too late to shape the war it had been designed for. Still, the idea mattered, because even when CDLs were not used in their most dramatic form, their existence forced planners to think differently about night combat. Darkness was no longer an absolute. It could be challenged, shaped, and partially controlled. And for the infantrymen, whether British, American, German, or Japanese, the implication was unsettling. A battlefield once governed by shadow could suddenly be rewritten by a beam of light, appearing without warning, stripping away the comfort of invisibility. That psychological truth, more than any single engagement, was the real legacy forming beneath the steel hulls of those strange tanks. And to understand why that mattered, we must look beyond doctrine and equipment, into the different angles through which armored searchlights changed the experience of war. For infantry, darkness is not just an absence of light. It is a system of survival. Eyes adapt slowly. Movement becomes careful. Sounds grow louder. In the dark, soldiers learn to trust instinct more than sight. Shapes blur. Distance is guessed. Fear exists, but it is softened by invisibility. Armored searchlights were designed to destroy that balance. When a high-intensity beam snapped on, the human eye had no defense. Night vision vanished instantly. Pupils contracted painfully. Men who had been invisible seconds before were suddenly outlined. Helmets, rifles, bodies sharply defined against the ground behind them. The effect was disorienting rather than dramatic. Soldiers did not always panic. Often, they froze. Movement felt dangerous. Depth perception collapsed. A trench that felt protective in darkness now felt exposed. Psychologically, the beam did something worse. It removed choice. To move was to be seen. To stay was to be illuminated. The light did not simply reveal, it commanded attention. This was especially significant in cultures and doctrines that relied on night concealment. Japanese infantry training emphasized patience, stillness, and endurance in darkness. The sudden loss of concealment undermined habits built over years of discipline. The terror was not of the light itself, but of what followed. Fire, movement, and attack now guided by vision instead of guesswork. From a tactical perspective, The CDL concept treated light the way artillery treated terrain. Illumination was not meant to be continuous. It was timed, swept, interrupted. The beam created corridors, bright lanes where attackers could see, and dark margins where defenders hesitated to move. By narrowing the beam through a slit, planners reduced the chance of the light source being targeted directly. The illuminated area could be shifted without moving the tank, creating uncertainty about the attacker's exact position. Engineers benefited immediately. Wire, mines, and obstacles could be identified. Infantry units maintained formation longer. Tanks avoided collisions and misdirection that plagued night advances. Just as importantly, illumination compressed decision-making time for defenders. A position that might hold under darkness could unravel under light. Every second illuminated was a second where concealment failed. The beam also worked vertically. Trench walls cast shadows. Men inside could be partially lit, partially hidden, producing confusion about who was exposed and who was not. Commanders hoped this would create hesitation, enough for assault troops to close the distance. The canal defense light was not a simple searchlight bolted onto armor. Inside the turret, a powerful carbon arc lamp generated the beam. 2 carbon rods created an intense white light when electricity passed between them. The system required constant monitoring. Electrodes burned away and had to be adjusted mid-operation. The light passed through lenses and filters before exiting the turret through a narrow vertical slit, usually just a few inches wide. Shutters could interrupt the beam rapidly, producing a flickering effect that further disoriented the eye. Operators controlled elevation and sweep while coordinating with the tank commander. Communication was critical. Too much light, too long, and the tank risked drawing fire. Too little, and the effect was lost. The entire system was heavy, complex, and demanding. Yet worked exactly as designed. In tests and limited operations, the beam maintained intensity at hundreds of meters. It could overpower moonlight, flares, and ambient glow. It could dominate a sector of ground completely. This was not illumination for visibility alone. It was illumination as psychological pressure, delivered from behind armor, advancing at walking speed. And while this explained how the system functioned, it did not answer a deeper question: why commanders hesitated to unleash it fully, and how enemies might respond once the novelty wore off. Those answers lie in the remaining angles: leadership, enemy adaptation, and the moral reality of turning light into a weapon. From a commander's perspective, the canal defense light was both attractive and unsettling. On paper, it offered order where night brought chaos. Units could advance on schedule. Engineers could work under illumination. Commanders could synchronize armor and infantry with greater confidence. But leadership in wartime is often shaped by memory, and memory warned against visible light. Searchlights in the First World War had drawn artillery fire almost immediately. Flares had betrayed advances. Any bright source risked becoming a focal point for every weapon within range. Even with armor, commanders worried that a CDL tank could become a magnet for anti-tank guns, mortars, or direct infantry fire. There was also the problem of coordination. Night operations were already complex. Adding a new, highly specialized system demanded precise timing, rehearsed communication, and disciplined restraint. One error, one beam switched on too early or too long, could unravel an entire assault. As a result, many senior officers treated CDLs as situational tools, not default weapons. They were held back, assigned to narrow roles, or repurposed for indirect lighting tasks where risk could be controlled. The irony was clear. The more valuable the technology seemed, the more carefully it was rationed. No weapon exists in isolation. Once revealed, it invites countermeasures. Defenders quickly learned that the light itself was not the only threat. The real danger came from what the beam enabled: accurate fire, movement, and coordination. If those could be disrupted, the light lost much of its power. The most immediate response was targeting the source. Even with a narrow slit, the light's origin could sometimes be inferred. Smoke, dust, and suppressive fire could obscure or deter the advancing tank. Terrain also mattered. Uneven ground, vegetation, and urban rubble created broken illumination, patches of light and shadow that could still be exploited by disciplined infantry. Japanese defensive doctrine, particularly in the Pacific, emphasized concealment in depth. Cave systems, reverse slopes, and jungle cover reduced the effectiveness of direct illumination. Even when lit, defenders were not always where the beam pointed. German forces in Europe, experienced with searchlights and flares, understood the value of patience under exposure. Training emphasized holding position, limiting movement, and waiting for the light to shift. In this way, armored illumination did not erase defensive skill, it challenged it. There is something inherently unsettling about using light to harm. The canal defense light did not kill directly. It did not explode or burn. Its purpose was subtler: to overwhelm the senses, to remove the comfort of darkness, to force exposure. Some saw this as humane, a way to reduce blind firing and confusion. Others saw it as psychological coercion, a manipulation of human vulnerability rather than physical force. In truth, it was both. War has always targeted perception. Smoke blinds. Noise disorients. Camouflage deceives. The CDL simply extended that logic into illumination itself. But its existence marked a shift. Darkness, once a neutral condition, became a contested space. Control of light meant control of tempo, movement, and fear. This moral ambiguity may explain why the weapon never achieved the prominence its designers expected. It was effective, but uncomfortable. Powerful, but situational. Commanders sensed its value while respecting its limits. By 1945, the canal defense light had proven something important, even in restraint. The battlefield was no longer governed solely by firepower, but by sensory dominance. And it was this realization, more than any single beam cutting the night, that shaped the turning point of armored illumination's role in the war. Because when theory met reality, the decisive question was no longer whether the light worked, but whether the war still needed it. That answer would emerge only at the moment when armored illumination faced its final test. The decisive moment for armored illumination did not arrive with a dramatic unveiling, but with a quiet realization. By late 1944 and early 1945, Allied forces in Europe had crossed from experimentation into momentum. Air superiority was overwhelming. Artillery coordination had reached unprecedented levels. Infantry, armor, and engineers moved with a confidence shaped by years of hard adaptation. The battlefield had changed faster than the canal defense light could redefine it. Yet there were moments when the concept finally met reality. In March 1945, Allied forces prepared to cross the Rhine River, the last great natural barrier protecting the German heartland. The operation demanded speed, coordination, and sustained movement under pressure. Bridges were down. Currents were strong. The far bank was defended. Night was chosen deliberately. Here, illumination was not meant to shock defenders, but to enable motion. Searchlights, including those mounted on armored vehicles, were used to create broad pools of reflected light by angling beams upward into low cloud cover. The effect was surreal. The river and its banks glowed as if under a pale, artificial dawn, while the source of the light remained difficult to pinpoint. This indirect illumination proved invaluable. Engineers could see anchor points, Infantry units could maintain formation. Vehicles moved without bottlenecking into darkness. The operation succeeded with remarkable efficiency, overwhelming German defenses already strained by material shortage and constant air attack. It was not the original CDL vision, but it was illumination proving its worth. At the same time, the original tactical concept faced its own reckoning. By 1945, the element of surprise had narrowed. Enemy forces were accustomed to night flares, star shells, and battlefield lighting. Any concentrated beam risked drawing immediate attention from artillery observers, anti-tank teams, or infantry armed with shaped charges. Commanders understood that the CDL's greatest strength, its brightness, was also its greatest vulnerability. And yet, when used carefully, the psychological effect remained undeniable. In exercises and limited engagements, defenders exposed to sudden illumination still hesitated. Night-trained instincts faltered. Even seasoned troops experienced momentary paralysis as their environment transformed without warning. The lesson was subtle but profound. Illumination did not need to dominate the battlefield to influence it. It only needed to appear at the right moment. But the war was moving quickly toward its conclusion. In the Pacific, American forces advanced island by island. Japanese defenses relied heavily on concealment and endurance. But by 1945, overwhelming firepower and air dominance defined outcomes more than innovation. Requests for armored illumination arrived when logistics could no longer support widespread deployment. The moment for a dramatic debut had passed. Instead, the CDL became a transitional weapon, bridging an older world of darkness-bound fighting and a newer one shaped by technology, coordination, and sensory control. This realization marked the turning point, not because the light failed, but because the war had learned to operate without needing it at center stage. And as Allied forces pushed deeper into Germany and toward final victory, armored illumination quietly receded from the spotlight, its influence absorbed into doctrine rather than celebrated in headlines. Yet the story was not finished, because understanding why the Canal Defense Light did not transform the war requires examining the pressures that ultimately limited its use and the battlefield realities that decided its fate. As the war entered its final phase, the Canal Defense Light faced a paradox common to many late-war innovations. It worked, but not in the war that now existed. By 1945, Allied doctrine had evolved rapidly. Night attacks were no longer rare or experimental. Infantry had learned to move in darkness with better navigation, radios, and coordination. Artillery could blanket suspected positions regardless of visibility. Aircraft could illuminate or strike targets at will. In this environment, the CDL no longer solved a central problem. It addressed one that was already being managed by other means. There were also hard operational realities. A CDL tank was still a tank, but one with its primary weapon removed. Its value depended entirely on timing and protection. If committed too early, it risked revealing an assault. If committed too late, its illumination arrived after the critical moment had passed. If exposed without infantry and armor support, it could be destroyed like any other vehicle. Commanders increasingly asked a difficult question. Was the trade-off worth it? In heavily contested environments, the answer was often no. German defenses in 1944-45 were adaptive and experienced. Anti-tank weapons were widely distributed. Artillery observers were skilled at identifying unusual battlefield signatures. A bright, moving light, however controlled, could draw attention faster than it could deliver advantage. This did not mean the concept was discarded. It meant it was absorbed. Illumination became one tool among many, rather than a centerpiece. Searchlights, armored or otherwise, were integrated into combined arms planning, used when terrain, weather, and timing aligned. When those conditions did not exist, commanders relied on firepower, speed, and air support instead. The original vision of tanks advancing behind a moving wall of light, freezing defenders in place, gave way to something quieter and more practical. The turning point, then, was not a single battle or decision. It was the recognition that sensory dominance had multiple paths, and light was only one of them. For the men who trained on the CDL, this realization was bittersweet. They had mastered a specialized craft, learned to operate a machine unlike any other, and carried its secrecy across continents. Yet many would see their role reduced or redefined as the war closed. Still, their work was not wasted, because the Canal Defense Light demonstrated something that would outlive it, that modern warfare was no longer only about who could fire farther or hit harder, but about who could shape what the enemy perceived. That lesson would echo far beyond 1945. As victory approached in Europe, Allied planners began to document what had worked, what had not, and why. The CDL was recorded not as a failure, but as a conditional success, powerful under specific circumstances, limited by others. And in those assessments lay the true turning point. The weapon had reached the end of its wartime journey, not in obsolescence, but in transformation. What followed was not abandonment, but reflection, because once the beams were switched off and the tanks returned to standard roles, the question remained, what had armored illumination changed, and what had it left behind? When the war in Europe ended in May 1945, the Canal Defense Light disappeared almost as quietly as it had been created. There were no victory parades for armored illumination. No iconic photographs captured beams cutting through enemy lines. To many soldiers, the CDL remained a curiosity, something rumored, trained on, but rarely seen in action. Yet its impact was not measured in spectacle. In post-war assessments, Allied planners reviewed the CDL with a sober understanding of its role. Reports acknowledged that the system performed as designed. The light was powerful. The control mechanisms worked. The psychological effect on exposed troops was real. What limited the weapon was not technology, but context. The battlefield of 1944 to 45 was saturated with firepower. Artillery could suppress defenders regardless of visibility. Aircraft dominated movement by day and night. Radar, improved communications, and coordinated combined arms tactics reduced the dependence on illumination alone. In that environment, a specialized tool had difficulty asserting itself. Nevertheless, commanders recognized specific areas where armored illumination had provided value. River crossings, engineering operations, and night logistics benefited from controlled light. Indirect illumination, reflecting beams off cloud cover, proved especially useful, creating visibility without obvious targets. These techniques were noted, studied, and preserved. More importantly, the CDL influenced how armies thought about sensory warfare. Illumination was no longer viewed as a crude necessity, but as a variable to be shaped deliberately. The idea that light could be timed, directed, and modulated, rather than simply turned on, became part of military thinking. For the soldiers who faced such illumination, the memory lingered differently. Infantry accounts describe the discomfort of sudden exposure, the loss of night vision, the unnatural clarity imposed on what should have remained hidden. Even when no attack followed immediately, the experience left an impression. Darkness, once trusted, felt less reliable. This psychological residue mattered, because warfare does not end when weapons fall silent. It continues in training manuals, doctrines, and assumptions about what the battlefield allows or denies. The CDL challenged one of the oldest assumptions of all, that night belonged equally to both sides. By the late 1940s, militaries around the world explored new ways to dominate visibility. Infrared experiments, night vision devices, and electronic sensors all drew from the same underlying insight: control what the enemy sees and you control how they fight. In this sense, the Canal Defense Light was not an endpoint, but a stepping stone. It marked a moment when armies attempted to bend the environment itself, light and dark, into a tactical asset. And while the CDL faded from inventories, its lessons remained embedded in post-war planning, shaping a future where darkness would no longer offer the sanctuary it once had. The second half of that legacy, how those lessons reshaped warfare beyond 1945, can only be understood by looking at what followed. In the years immediately after the war, the Canal Defense Light was quietly dismantled, both physically and conceptually. The armored turrets were removed. Tanks returned to conventional configurations. Manuals were archived. The secrecy that had once surrounded the program dissolved into footnotes and technical appendices. To the public, the CDL remained largely unknown. But inside military institutions, its influence persisted. Post-war studies framed the CDL not as a failed weapon, but as an experiment ahead of its time. Analysts noted that its effectiveness depended on conditions that were difficult to guarantee in large-scale, fast-moving operations. Weather, terrain, enemy preparedness, and coordination all had to align. When they did, illumination proved valuable. When they did not, it became a liability. This conditional effectiveness became a guiding lesson. Rather than pursuing dedicated illumination tanks, armies shifted toward distributed solutions. Artillery flares became more sophisticated. Aircraft provided illumination from altitude. Engineers developed portable lighting systems for bridging and logistics. Each tool addressed a specific need without concentrating risk in a single platform. More importantly, attention turned to technologies that could see without being seen. Infrared scopes, early night vision devices, and electronic sensors began to reshape the concept of night combat. Instead of forcing darkness into submission with light, armies sought to bypass it entirely. The goal was no longer to illuminate the battlefield, but to perceive it invisibly. In that shift, the CDL's most radical idea, controlling perception, found a new expression. For infantrymen trained after the war, night no longer meant blindness. It meant operating within a layered sensory environment where light, heat, and signal could all betray position. The CDL had helped initiate that transition by demonstrating that darkness was not immutable. Even in the Pacific context, where the CDL never played its intended role, its conceptual relevance endured. Japanese defensive doctrine had relied heavily on concealment and patience. The recognition that technology could strip away those advantages reinforced post-war emphasis on dispersion, depth, and deception. The psychological dimension remained central. Veterans who encountered sudden illumination remembered not fear alone, but disorientation, a feeling of being placed inside someone else's design. The light did not simply reveal, it dictated rhythm and reaction. That sensation would later be echoed by soldiers facing flares, sensors, and surveillance technologies in conflicts far removed from World War II. By the mid-20th century, warfare had entered an era where dominance increasingly meant controlling information and perception, not just terrain and firepower. The Canal Defense Light, obscure and rarely celebrated, had contributed to that evolution. Its legacy was not measured in enemy casualties or captured ground, but in altered assumptions. Night was no longer neutral. Darkness was no longer equal. Visibility itself had become a contested resource. And as the beams of armored searchlights faded from the battlefield, the war moved on, leaving behind a quieter but enduring transformation. All that remained was to reflect on what that transformation truly meant. For most of human history, night belonged to no one. It slowed armies, softened fear, and placed limits on violence. Darkness was not merely the absence of light. It was a boundary accepted by both sides as part of war's natural order. The canal defense light challenged that boundary. It did so not with fire or force, but with control. A beam of light, shaped and timed, turned concealment into exposure and uncertainty into hesitation. It reminded soldiers that even the most familiar protections could be engineered away. Yet the CDL story is not one of domination. It is a story of transition. The weapon arrived at a moment when warfare was already accelerating beyond it. Air power, artillery coordination, and communications were reshaping battle faster than any single innovation could claim center stage. The light worked, but the war no longer depended on alone. Still, its meaning endures. The CDL marked one of the first deliberate attempts to weaponize perception itself. It treated the human senses as a battlefield, subject to planning, rehearsal, and manipulation. In doing so, it pointed toward a future where victory would depend not only on strength, but on what the enemy could see, hear, and understand. Modern warfare would take that lesson far further, into sensors, night vision, electronic warfare, and surveillance that never sleep. The beams that once cut through the dark have been replaced by invisible systems, but the principle remains unchanged. Control the night. Control the moment. Control the fight. And for the infantryman standing in the sudden glare, whether in Europe's fields or the imagined defenses of the Pacific, the experience was unforgettable. The darkness they trusted could vanish in an instant, replaced by a design they did not choose. In that instant, the night stopped being neutral. That was the Canal Defense Light's quiet legacy. Not a weapon that changed the war, but a warning that the battlefield itself could be rewritten. And once that lesson was learned, there was no returning the night to what it had been before.